Long before any philosopher ever spoke beneath the columns of the Agora, long before the world heard the names of Socrates or Plato, there was only a hill, a jagged rise of stone, carved by time and wind, overlooking the Attic plain. This hill would come to be known as the Acropolis, the High City. But back then, it had no name, no temples, no legends, just earth and stone, and the first quiet footsteps of those who would build the foundation of Athens. Around the year 3000 before the Common Era, Neolithic settlers arrived. These early people were not warriors or kings. They were gatherers, farmers, makers of tools and stories. They lived in small clusters, close to springs and shaded groves, raising families beneath the same sky where future gods would someday be imagined. As centuries passed, others came, the Mycenaeans, bringing with them new ways of building, of organizing, of burying their dead in deep shaft graves lined with gold and symbolism. By 1200 before the Common Era, Athens was not yet a shining capital, but it was more than a village. There were signs of hierarchy, of wealth, of planned structures and spiritual order. Then, like the flicker of a candle swallowed by the wind, it all fell silent. The collapse of the Mycenaean world sent tremors through the land, and for nearly 400 years, darkness followed. Not of night, but of memory. Trade disappeared, writing was lost, the great tombs stood untouched, and fields grew wild again. This was the Greek Dark Age, but even in darkness the soil remembers. The people remained, scattered, quiet, surviving, and over time, something began to stir. By the 8th century before the Common Era, Athens began to rise again, slowly, carefully. A new form of community emerged, unlike the kingdoms that had ruled before. This was the birth of the polis, the city-state, where identity, loyalty, and destiny became tied not to a king, but to the city itself. A structure of cooperation, debate, and collective purpose. The spark had returned, but this time it was different. Beneath the old stones, something was forming that would challenge centuries of tradition and power. And with that stirring came the need for new rules, new voices, and a different kind of leadership. Behind the marble temples and Golden Age myths, the truth of early Athens was far more turbulent. Beneath the rising columns of culture and knowledge, there boiled a city fractured by inequality. A city where the rich grew richer, the poor grew desperate, and injustice stained every corner of daily life. By the 7th century, before the Common Era, power rested firmly in the hands of the aristocracy. A small group of noble families controlled the land, the laws, and the lives of nearly everyone beneath them. Farmers sank into debt, and if they could not repay, they were often sold into slavery, not by foreign invaders, but by their own neighbors. The seeds of rage were sown, and from that unrest came a name, Draco. His reforms arrived like a hammer, the first written laws of Athens, carved into wood and stone so that all could see. But they were not merciful. Every offense, no matter how small, was met with brutal consequence. Theft, death. Insolence, death. His code was so unforgiving that even centuries later, the word draconian would become a synonym for cruelty dressed as order. And yet, even this was not enough to stabilize the city. The pressure continued to mount until, in 594 before the Common Era, the Athenians turned to a different figure, Solon, a poet, a statesman, a reformer. Where Draco used fear, Solon used reason. He canceled debts, freed those who had been enslaved by them, and banned the practice entirely for the future. He restructured society into new classes based not solely on birth, but on wealth and productivity, giving citizens new opportunities to participate in civic life. He created councils and courts, and though power still favored the elite, a door had been opened. For the first time, common Athenians began to find a voice in the governance of their city. But Solon's reforms were just the beginning. Decades later, after more waves of turmoil and the fall of tyrants, another name rose, Cleisthenes. In 507 before the Common Era, he introduced a radical shift, the foundation of Athenian democracy. No longer would family name or noble blood date power. Now citizens gathered in the assembly to vote. Officials were chosen not by inheritance, but by lottery. Neighborhoods, not clans, became the basis of political identity. Cleisthenes broke the grip of the old aristocracy and handed the city's future to its people. It was bold, it was unprecedented, and it was fragile. But in that fragile design lived a revolutionary idea, that a city could rule itself. An idea that would echo, ripple, and one day collide with forces far beyond Athens' borders. With the threat of the Persian Empire driven back in a wave of resistance and strategy, Athens stood victorious, not just in battle, but in identity. Most cities might retreat, rebuild, or simply recover after such a war. But Athens, it surged forward. Emboldened by triumph at battles like Marathon and Salamis, the city gathered allies under the banner of the Delian League, a coalition, they claimed, for mutual protection. But as the gold flowed in, it did not build ships alone. It built monuments, temples, marble dreams made real. At the helm stood Pericles, a statesman not of impulse, but of vision. Under his leadership, Athens was sculpted into a jewel of civilization. The Parthenon, rising in perfect proportion atop the Acropolis, was more than a structure. It was a declaration, a symbol of triumph, of reverence to Athena, of the belief that beauty and power could coexist in stone. Beneath this canopy of grandeur, the city bloomed with ideas. Sophocles took the stage, crafting tragedies that held mirrors to the soul. Herodotus began weaving the past into story, becoming one of the first to ask not only what happened, but why. The sculptor Phidias carved gods and heroes with such mastery that their forms still breathe through time. In the Agora, citizens debated, merchants traded, and philosophers wandered, asking questions that still haunt lecture halls and late-night thoughts. Schools were not merely places of instruction, they were forges where minds were tempered. Logic, ethics, rhetoric, all chiseled from the raw stone of human curiosity. And through it all, democracy pulsed. Though far from perfect, women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. It was a model unlike any other, an experiment where the people themselves shaped the fate of the city. Every citizen could speak, could vote, could challenge authority in the open air. In the 5th century before the Common Era, Athens was not just a city. It was the intellectual heart of the known world. Its influence stretched not through conquest but through thought, through theater, through architecture, through the simple but dangerous idea that free minds could build something eternal. But glory is never without shadow. Even as Athens reached for the heavens, clouds were gathering at the horizon, shadows of conflict, ambition, and pride, the kind that doesn't strike with armies first, but with decisions made in bright rooms, echoing with applause. At the height of its brilliance, Athens stood tall, a city convinced of its destiny. Its art lit the world, its philosophy challenged the heavens, and its democracy, though imperfect, beat with revolutionary promise. But with greatness came ambition, and with ambition came enemies. Across the mountains and valleys, another power watched, Sparta. Where Athens was bold, Sparta was disciplined. Where Athens built beauty, Sparta built silence and steel. The rivalry grew sharper with every rising wall, every new alliance, until finally, in the year 431 before the Common Era, diplomacy gave way to siege engines. The Peloponnesian War had begun, not a single battle, but a slow, grinding conflict between two visions of Greece. Athens, naval and cultural; Sparta, land-bound and militaristic. It was not just a war of weapons, it was a war of ideals. Athens, confident behind its long walls and fed by the sea, believed it could outlast any siege. But as enemy forces pressed closer, a far greater threat slipped through the gates unnoticed. Disease, no army, no armor, just fever and breath and touch. The plague of Athens swept through the city in waves. In crowded homes and dusty temples, it made no distinction between the great and the unknown. Within a matter of months, it claimed tens of thousands, including Pericles himself, the architect of the city's golden age. Without his leadership, fractures widened, trust eroded. The assembly, once a symbol of unity, now echoed with suspicion and fear. The war dragged on. Decades passed, battles won, then lost, treaties made, then broken, allies turned enemies, enemies turned shadows. Sparta, with Persian support and relentless pressure, wore Athens down piece by piece. By 404 before the Common Era, the unthinkable happened. Athens surrendered. The walls came down, its fleet was burned. And the very democracy it had once pioneered was dissolved, replaced by an oligarchy known for its cruelty and vengeance. The stage that once gave birth to tragedy now lived it. The proud city was brought to its knees, but even in ruin, something refused to die. The streets still echoed with questions. The stones still remembered their builders, and the people, though bruised, though silenced, still carried the ember of what Athens had once stood for. an ember that would not remain in the ashes for long. Even with its political influence shattered and its military humbled, Athens refused to fade. The banners of empire may have passed to others, but in the 4th century before the Common Era, the city still glowed, not with swords or ships, but with thought. It was no longer the dominant power in the Greek world, yet something deeper remained. In its streets and stoas, in its shaded courtyards and smoky symposiums, minds sharpened like blades. Here, questions became weapons, and no one wielded them more fearlessly than Socrates. With nothing but words, he stood before crowds and challenged everything: power, tradition, even the gods themselves. He asked not for loyalty, but for truth, not for silence, but for reason. And though the city condemned him, his voice was never truly silenced. From the echo of Socrates' death came the vision of Plato. He built the academy, not of soldiers, but of seekers. There, in dialogue and in theory, he dreamed of a just world built on ideals rather than appetite. His student, Aristotle, took those dreams and rooted them in the ground, studying biology, ethics, politics, logic, organizing the very structure of human knowledge in ways that would shape science and philosophy for millennia. In Athens, these were not isolated geniuses. They were part of a current, a culture, a pulse that said, "What you think matters." And while philosophy gave the city its spine, theater gave it voice. On sacred stages, tragedy and comedy collided, offering not distraction, but reflection. Aeschylus, Euripides, Aristophanes, they crafted dramas that mirrored society's fears, its flaws, its hopes. In a single afternoon, a citizen could laugh, weep, and leave transformed. The audience wasn't passive, it was part of the process. The city itself was the theater. Even as Macedon rose in the north, led by a young conqueror named Alexander, Athens remained the soul of the Greek world. Alexander may have taken armies across continents, but it was in Athens that he found his tutor, Aristotle. And it was from Athens that his vision of a Hellenic world, guided by reason and culture, would be born. So no, Athens was no longer an empire, but it had become something more enduring. A symbol, a city of living memory, a place where stone whispered ideas and where the future kept returning, not for its power, but for its mind. And while the maps of power would shift again, the question lingered in the air like smoke after flame. What happens when empires crumble, but wisdom remains? In the year 146 before the Common Era, the armies of Rome swept through Greece and claimed Athens as their own. The age of the polis was over, yet in a twist of fate, the conqueror became the student. Rome, though ruthless in expansion, held a deep reverence for the Greek world, its art, its architecture, its intellect. And Athens, even under foreign rule, did not wither. It transformed. No longer a political powerhouse, it became a sanctuary of knowledge. Roman elites sent their sons to Athens to study philosophy, rhetoric, and ethics. The city became a classroom for emperors, a living archive of wisdom where marble still carried the fingerprints of genius. As centuries passed, Athens weathered storms that toppled kingdoms. Barbarian raids carved scars into its walls. The Byzantine Empire swept in with new faith and new structures. Then came the Ottomans, reshaping skylines and rewriting laws. Yet through it all, the essence of Athens, that restless spirit of inquiry, of creation, of resilience, never vanished. The Parthenon stood battered but unbroken, watching centuries roll by like clouds across the Attic sky. It was not until the 19th century that the world turned its gaze back with purpose. Excavators dug into the soil and found history not in myths, but in stone. Broken statues, shattered columns, foundations that once held temples, theaters, and schools. Artists came, sketching the ruins in silence. Revolutionaries looked to Athens as a symbol of rebirth, of nations built not just by might, but by meaning. And in the modern age, that meaning grew louder. Museums across the globe displayed its treasures. Digital technology rebuilt what time had erased. Virtual reconstructions brought breath back to silent ruins. Tourists walked the same paths as Socrates once did, tracing steps worn by centuries. Today, in the 21st century, Athens is more than a capital. It is a threshold, a living dialogue between what was and what could be. It does not pretend to be frozen in time. Instead, it embraces change while carrying the weight of memory. In its streets, history is not buried, it's exposed, honored, and shared. Every column cracked by war, every mosaic faded by sun, every name carved in fading script. They all speak, softly but clearly, echoes of democracy, of art, of human reason. And as the world rushes forward, Athens waits, not behind but beneath, reminding us that true greatness is not measured in empires, but in the endurance of ideas.